More answers to the question, what is truth? I've had a lot of responses to various videos in which I've discussed the concept of truth, particularly with reference to the different kinds of truth statements that may be claimed by atheists on the one hand and theists on the other. I've suggested that sometimes they may be making different kinds of truth claims and not realizing this, and also that sometimes theists make the mistake of thinking that they're making empirical truth claims when in fact they're not, or shouldn't be. Or maybe atheists think that theists are making empirical truth claims when they're in fact not doing that. From a whole range of responses, it's clear to me that people haven't really considered in any depth the notion of truth and often have a rather simplistic idea of it. Typical comments are things like this. This is what's wrong with the world today. Truth isn't truth because there are different kinds of truth. WTF? Well, I agree in a way with this. One of the problems with the world today is indeed that people don't realise that there are several kinds of truth. Philosophers have known and discussed this for thousands of years. Today, though, we want to simplify everything, turn everything into black and white. Let's just consider some of the different types of truth statements. Now, there's a lot of overlap between these different kinds of truth, and a statement can fall into more than one of these categories. Now, some of these are broader categories that contain subcategories. Some may be just different words for the same thing. But let's start with the distinction between analytic truth and synthetic truth. First of all, analytic truth. This is a statement that's true by definition. Its truth is contained within the meaning of its terms. So, for example, a statement like this, all bachelors are unmarried. This statement is true because the definition of bachelor includes the concept of being unmarried. One of the interesting things about this kind of statement is that you can say something like this, all Martians are from Mars. And this remains analytically true even if there's no such thing as a Martian. It's unrelated to empirical truth. Now, whether or not these analytical truths, these kinds of statements, are valid and distinct from certain other kinds of truths has been a subject of extensive debate among philosophers. But just the fact that it's being debated so extensively is itself, of course, evidence that the question of truth is far from simple. As opposed to these analytic truths, there are synthetic truths. A synthetic statement is a statement whose truth depends on how the world actually is, rather than on definitions alone. For example, the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. This is a synthetic truth because it corresponds to an empirical fact about the world. We can go and check, although you might also find one in Paris, Texas, or in Nevada. But the Eiffel Tower is in Paris is a statement that we can check. It's an empirical statement about the world. We can go and see for ourselves, is it true? Now, often this seems to be the only kind of truth that many of my critics, and perhaps also critics of religion in general, are prepared to accept. You can argue that point, but you must understand that this is a complex issue and is something which has in fact been debated for thousands of years. Then we have the contrast between an a priori truth and an a posteriori truth. An a priori truth is one that can be known independently of experience. An example of this may be 2 + 2 = 4. This truth can be grasped through reason alone without needing to count physical objects. Other examples might be a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. This is intuited without requiring any physical measurement. Some would argue that a statement such as every effect has a cause might be an a priori truth. Or is this instead an empirical truth, something derived from experience? Kant would have argued that it is something known intuitively, but not everyone would agree. Tomorrow comes after today. Is that an a priori truth? Or perhaps it's an analytic truth. Maybe it's both. After today is contained within the meaning of tomorrow. On the other hand, is it based on a statement such as time flows in only one direction? Which is what? Is that an empirical statement or is it an a priori statement? It gets very complicated very quickly. So following on from these a priori truths is a posteriori truth. This is a truth that can only be known through sensory experience or empirical observation. For example, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. This is an a posteriori truth. It can only be known through experimentation and observation. Note again that these categories of truth are not mutually exclusive. An analytical truth may also be a priori, and a synthetic truth may also be a posteriori. Whether it always has to be, again, is something that we would need to discuss. Then we have the contrast between necessary and contingent truth. A statement that could not be false under any circumstances is this: triangles have three sides. This is necessarily true because it's part of what defines a triangle. So again, this overlaps with a priori truth. On the other hand, a contingent truth is something like this: Barack Obama was the 44th President of the United States. That happens to be true, but it could have been false. That is a contingent truth. It could have been different under different historical circumstances. Then there's a contrast between relative truth and absolute truth. A relative truth is something that depends on the perspective of the person or the context in which it's expressed. For example, the statement, spicy food is delicious, may be true for one person, but not for another, making it relative to individual taste. It's not simply objectively true or false. You are beautiful is another truth of this kind. In contrast to this is absolute truth, truth that is unchanging and universally valid regardless of circumstances. An example of this might be the sum of the interior angles of a Euclidean triangle is 180 degrees. This holds as true universally in the context of Euclidean geometry. Note, though, that Euclidean geometry is not the only kind of geometry, and it's only true within Euclidean geometry. There's also, for example, spherical geometry. If a triangle is on the surface of a sphere, the angles add up to more than 180 degrees. Then we have moral or ethical truth, truth about what is right or wrong, and this is often debated in terms of objectivity or subjectivity. An example of an ethical truth might be, it's wrong to harm others unnecessarily. Some would argue that this is an objective moral truth, while others would see it as culturally or personally determined. And I'll finish up with scientific truth, or what might be called empirical truth, I suppose. And this is a truth that's established through empirical methods and is subject to revision based on new evidence. An example of this might be the Earth orbits the Sun. This is accepted as true within the current scientific framework. Again, obviously there's overlap with other kinds of truth here. Strictly speaking, in purely empirical terms, this statement is not actually true. At the very least, it ought to be something more like the Sun and the Earth each orbit the centre of gravity between them. It just so happens that because of the huge mass differential between the Earth and the Sun, that centre of gravity falls within the body of the Sun itself. Actually, of course, it's even much more complicated than this because of the presence of the other planets. There are more variations on all these things. You can debate each and every one of these categories. You can argue that some categories can be reduced to others. You can argue that some of these are not really truth at all. Philosophers have been debating these kinds of issues for thousands of years. My point is that claiming that there's only one kind of truth is way too simplistic, particularly when you mean by that only empirical truth or maybe a posteriori truth. Even if you think I'm wrong about that, you still need to be aware of the kinds of statements that your opponent in a debate is using. What kind of truth are they claiming for their statements? Perhaps you can even help them to determine and clarify that for themselves, since they probably don't even know. First of all, though, you have to be aware of the kinds of truth statements that you yourself are making. You have to be aware of the many possibilities.